This happened to me about 8 years ago, I think. We lived next door to my parents in a mobile home, and our mobile home was situated further back on the property, with lots of trees and foliage around. I saw a man pull up in an old beat-up yellow and orange Ford pickup truck. He started walking down to my house, and thinking that it was maybe someone to see my dad, I called up to his house. My dad answered the phone, but with the call forwarding, it rang into his cell phone and he was in town at the store. By the time the man got to my door, the call had been dropped, and I continued talking into the phone like I was in the middle of a conversation, since I was the only person now on the property, other than my young daughter sleeping in her bedroom. I locked my screen door and asked the man what he wanted. He told me that he was apparently from Enterprise Rental Cars to pick me up and take me somewhere. I told him that I didn't call Enterprise for anything, and he insisted that I did. He wanted me to let him in too, so that we could discuss this. No way in hell was I opening that door. I just told him no and to please just go away. I shut the other door and locked it too, and I grabbed an aluminium baseball bat out of the hall closet and stood there just waiting for him to leave my porch. He stood on my porch for about 5 minutes before just walking back to his truck. He sat in his truck for about 5 more minutes before leaving, and during this time, I'd gotten my dad back on the phone and was telling him what was happening. When the guy finally left, he also went down the road the same way he'd come from, which I also found odd because if he actually was looking for an address, he would have gone slower, looking around. While in the driveway, he was parked too far away for me to see a license plate number, and I'm pretty sure that a company like Enterprise would not send someone out to a house dressed in all black. Black jeans, black long-sleeve shirt, black ball cap, in the middle of summer, mind you, and in an ancient, beat-up vehicle with no identification. Also, he didn't go to my parents' house in the front first, just all the way back to my house. There were no other vehicles sitting in the driveway too, and it would seem like no one was home. I truly think that he was there to probably rob us, and since I met him at the door, I often wonder what he was contemplating while just standing on my porch for so long and sitting in his vehicle for so long. I'm a petite female, and mind you, he was a pretty big guy. I'm really grateful that he didn't try anything that day, because if he did, I was screwed. About 2 years ago, I worked at a movie store inside a mall. I've had tons of strange experiences with customers, but this one definitely tops them off. I was 20 at the time, and this guy was over 6 foot, late 40s, very hefty, and always had this weird, zombified expression on his face. He came in about once a week, and one of my co-workers had even warned me about him, how he was just a little off, but I still treated him with as much respect as I did everyone else. One day, he came in and we talked for a bit, but it got a little awkward and I kept trying to end the conversation and look busy by tagging items behind the counter. And he just kind of stood there in silence, watching me for about 20 minutes and finally left. A few days later, he comes back in and walks up to me, holding a large container. He says, "I made 4 pounds of enchiladas at home today, just for you. I remembered you like Mexican food." I don't remember at all telling him that I liked it, but I do know that I went to the Mexican restaurant across the way every lunch break. I just politely accepted it and put it in the back office. I was convinced that he used his jizz in it or something like that, but another few days later, he came back in and had a drawing for me of a dragon. Now, I love dragons, but I never once told him that, and I know that for sure. And this drawing looked like it took hours to make. And at this point, I was beginning to get a little freaked out. I had him leave it on the counter though, so I could just throw it away later like I did the Mexican food. Later on, I was given about a week vacation, I think, and during that week, I had cut my hair about 12 inches or so. The day I came back, I got a shift with my manager and I told her all about the guy, and immediately she was weirded out for me. And no shit, a few minutes later, I see the dude walking around in the mall. He was going towards the exit and didn't look at me once, and my manager tells me to go to the back office. I go and wait until she comes to get me, and when she does, she tells me that I need to make a report to the mall security immediately. Apparently, when I ran back there, he turned around to come in and walked all throughout the store. And when she asked him if he needed help with something, he said, "I can't believe she cut her hair," and then just briskly walked out. So I eventually go to the mall security office to make a report, and we went through all these videos from the cameras of when the guy came to visit me. But there was one video that really stood out, and it still sends chills throughout my body just thinking about it. The video shows him pulling into the parking lot of the mall, and about 3 minutes later, I arrive. This was really early in the morning, and no customers were here yet, but there were cars in the lot. And I didn't see him at all, and it shows me walking towards the entrance and him following me. Right as I open the entrance door, though, the man starts sprinting towards me. I walked inside just in time, and it shows him stop and just stand in front of the door, watching me through the glass walk a little further away. He begins walking normally inside the mall, and I just never noticed him behind me. And that part really messed me up. It was like watching the last footage before a kidnapping or murder on Dateline or something. The video gave the security every reason to ban him from the mall too, and they did. But they later told me that they gave him a background check, and apparently he had 4 counts of having child pornography on his person and was on probation. Back in 2011, I was within a circle of friends that made it a tradition to go camping in a certain spot every May long weekend. The spot we chose was in a beautiful area right on the edge of a large lake and was located on government land. The lake itself had a dam on it too, so during May long weekend, the water levels were always low, if not completely empty, making it possible to walk across it. The people were allowed to camp there as long as they weren't causing trouble or making a mess, and it was generally a good time for everyone. The spots themselves were paced far enough apart that you had your own privacy, but not far enough that you couldn't meet other people. In this particular year, our spot was in the middle of a small hill with one camp below us and one above us. The first night of our trip happened without any incident, really. During the second day, the people staying at the site below us had moved in. We didn't think much of it and continued drinking throughout the day and into the night. At about around midnight, I'd say, the people at the campsite below us were just really out of control. They were yelling and screaming, and their music had gotten even louder, so our friend Ben went down to ask them to turn it down a bit. And he was promptly punched in the face, and he came back to inform us that he was 90% sure that they were all on drugs. After that, the vibe wasn't anywhere near as relaxed anymore, and we were all somewhat on edge. I was feeling really tired too, so I decided that I'd just go to bed. Some of my friends were still awake, including Ben and one couple, Lily and Derek, that were visiting another campsite we'd made friends with that day. I could hear that campsite below us still blasting their music and partying pretty hard, but I just tried to ignore it and go to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I was jolted awake. Part of this is just somewhat of a blur for me, but all I know is that I sat straight up as soon as I heard the screaming and yelling coming from outside of my tent. I quickly ran outside to find our campsite was in total chaos. But one of my friends was clutching their chest, and people were running around and screaming to call 911. I was quickly informed of what happened too. Apparently, not long after I'd gone to bed, the people camping at the site below us decided that they weren't finished talking to Ben, and on their way up, They had encountered the Lily and Derek walking back. Now, Derek and Ben are about the same height and have the same colour hair, so they thought and assumed that Derek was Ben and bottled both him and Lily over the head with a full glass of bottle. I don't know if it was the same guys that showed up at our campsite, but I was told that everyone else was sitting around the fire when 2 or 3 huge guys just appeared from the darkness and walked over to them. One had a paring knife and the other had a butcher's knife in their hand. Ben saw the knives and had gotten up to talk to them and had barely spoken a word when the guy with the paring knife stabbed him once in the chest. At the same time, some people from the campsite above had seen the guys coming and came down to help. One of the guys, Tim, was coming down the hill when the guy with the butcher's knife ran up to him and stabbed him in the stomach. From there, a sheer panic ensued. People called 911, but the ambulance was over half an hour away. And this is where I came out of the tent. Tim's wound was bleeding profusely and he was losing blood way too quickly. His friends ended up putting him in the back of his car and speeding off to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben was also bleeding, but his wound wasn't as deep as Tim's, and we were able to keep him calm until an ambulance arrived. The guys with the knives ran off into the darkness, back down to the campsite and took off in the Land Rover. My boyfriend at the time and I had gotten into his car and drove to the entrance to try and flag down the policemen on their way to the scene. Once they arrived, we were informed to stay in the car as they had released a canine search unit to hunt down the people who stabbed our friends. By the end of the night, they had arrested the men. They had tried to flee by driving their vehicle across the lake bed where they got stuck in a muddy section of the lake. They were on a concoction of several drugs, as suspected, and luckily both Tim and Ben survived, although Tim had lost a lot of blood and took a few weeks to recover from his wounds. Derek and Lily had huge goose eggs, and possibly one person had a concussion, but I can't really recall that. It was definitely the scariest thing that I've ever experienced, and a few of us had to testify against them in court. I've actually provided an online article in the description below if anyone's interested in reading it. I'm honestly such a grumpy tomboy that I never imagined in a million years that I would end up with a would-be stalker, especially not with the career I chose. I was a forensic death investigator, forensic police officers that generally work with the DA's office and or the medical examiner's office that looks into cases of suspicious death like homicides and accidents and stuff. Occasionally, I'd run into people that had a passing interest in what I did because they'd seen CSI or Law and Order a few times. No big deal, right? Wrong. So very, very wrong. It all started with the homicide scene that I'd been called to at an ungodly hour in the morning when Mr. Fanboy showed up. He was around his late 30s to early 40s, average height and modestly fit, chatting away with one of the poor unis guarding the scene. It wasn't a big deal. It happens because people are curious, but then he whips out a camera and starts snapping a few pictures. At this point, I figured he really was a nosy, tone-deaf journalist and decided to give him a polite lecture on how inappropriate it was to take photos of a crime scene, especially when we're getting ready to move the deceased's body. I deleted the pictures and sent him on his way and figured that I'd never see him again. But no, he pops up again a week later at another questionable scene. It doesn't click yet that something is seriously off until a week after that he shows up at another scene, this one being a complete county away from the last one. So, I worked a major city in Texas through the medical examiner's office, so we took cases from several surrounding counties, a few thousand square miles in fact. And it was odd that this guy would just show up to a rather standard scene on the outer edge of our covered area, even if he was the press. I mention it to some co-workers when I get the chance, and they've noticed him hanging around some of the scenes too. When he showed up again, me and a uniformed officer shake him down to see who the hell he is and why he's got a major hard-on for rubbernecking crime scenes. I'm used to rubberneckers, and I get it that people are curious and sometimes a bit morbid when something happened nearby. But once the excitement and the newness wears off, they go on about their business. But Mr. Fanboy, he doesn't have a criminal record, like not even speeding or parking tickets, so my superior had a talk with him. Basically explained that he was making everyone nervous and it looked really shady to just start hanging out at crime scenes. And so he disappears for a couple of weeks, before switching to a new tactic. If he can't hang around the crime scenes, why not hang around the investigators? But of course, only the female ones, right? So Fanboy shows up at one of my favorite drive bars that I frequent because it was near my home. Over 30 miles from where I work, mind you. Now, I'm a 5'7" woman who doesn't look imposing at the least. And my co-workers used to tease that I look like I was a kid playing dress-up in my uniform. Like most women, I tried to be polite with the guy who at the time was about 20 years my senior, but declined any offer of a drink. He doesn't take the hints and chats me up with some of the creepiest shit that I've ever heard. But what's the worst crime scene you've investigated? Have you ever worked on a case where the victim was dismembered? Do you think murder and rape cases are really about power dynamics and not sexually motivated? So, obviously, I'm creeped the hell out. I mean, those are things that I don't even want to talk about with a therapist, much less a dude who is giving me some seriously rapey murdery vibes. I completely shut him down, and not even trying to be polite, and he seemed a little put off, but not apologetic in the least. I went home and put my service weapon back on and called my supervisor to give them a heads up and start a paper trail for an RO. He served with a cease and desist a few days later, and I figured that the threat of an RO and trouble with the police would deter him from escalating any further. But not even 24 hours after the cease and desist is delivered, he's back to shadowing crime scenes like it's going out of style. At another female investigator scene, he gets into an altercation with one of the uniformed officers, in fact. He gets slammed with trespassing, obstruction, and a few other charges, but since he has no record, he's let out on bail, and shows up to a scene that I'm working on not 3 days later. We get into a scuffle after he breaks one of my guy's nose to get onto the scene, and he's not as strong as he looks, but I still ended up with a black eye. He looked worse, though, by the time my partner and I finally got him in cuffs. An investigation is opened, and it turned up a police scanner and a lot of creepy journals in his car, as well as notes on where I lived and worked, along with info on one of the other female investigators. From what I've heard through the grapevine, his mother's house, where he was living, it was also as creepy as hell. Yeah, I never thought people would be that obsessed with crime scenes and forensic or the like that they'd end up going to jail for it. But here we are. I'm also very aware that he probably had a lot of very unsavory things planned for me and or one of my co-workers, which still makes my skin crawl to this day. So this happened a few years ago when I was 13. I was somewhat popular in school at the time, and I had around 4 very close friends, Rose, Lynn, Noah, and Zach. We went on many adventures around that time, camping, road trips, the beach. Noah's family was pretty wealthy, and all of our families were pretty lenient with the rules. One day, the summer before 8th grade, we went on a camping trip with Lynn's older sister, Margaret, and Zach's older brother, Todd. So there were 7 of us. Lynn and Zach and I were 13, and Noah and Rose were 14, and Margaret and Todd, they were both 17. We decided to go camping in a nearby forest around 20 miles from Noah's house. It was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Noah's house and his neighborhood were the closest homes, and there were no signals for phones or any electronics. We get to the spot easily and without problems, and we make camp. The girls were in one tent and the boys in the other, and maybe it was a bad idea to have 17s, ages 13 to 17, with no phones in the woods, but our parents were lenient, like I said, and confident that we would be fine since the woods were not known for anything bad or dangerous or anything. So we set up the tents and go swimming in a nearby lake and come back and make dinner over a fire, which was about 20 feet away from the tents, which were 4 feet away from each other, by the way. We have s'mores and do all those stupid camping things before Lynn and Margaret announce that they're going to bed. That left Todd, Rose, Zach, Noah and I as we joked around and told scary stories and just overall had a really good time. But then Margaret walks up annoyed and tells us that whatever it is messing with the side of the tent to stop it. Keep in mind that no one had left the group and the tents were far enough away to not bother anyone in the tents. She explains that someone keeps on touching the side of the tent, running something on it, and we just kind of dismiss her. Todd states that it's probably just a tree branch, and Rose and I decide to go and sleep as well. So we head back to the tent, and Lynn is asleep, and we settle in, me closest to the opening. Margaret next to Lynn, who is at the opposite side of the tent, and Rose is in between Margaret and I. I managed to fall asleep easily, within about 5 minutes, I think, until I woke up suddenly for what seemed like no reason. I checked my phone. I brought a portable charger just to take pictures, and it was literally the middle of the night at 2:15. I looked around and, my eyes getting used to the darkness, tried to figure out what I woke up to. There's a tapping sound on the tent, and that was the first thing I noticed. And then a soft giggling. It sounded somewhat deep too, like a male voice, but I couldn't be sure. After what felt like an hour, but was probably just a minute or two, the tapping and the giggling just stopped. I was convinced that it was my imagination for some time, or maybe one of the boys was just trying to prank us, or even a tree branch like Todd suggested earlier. Telling myself that it was just a tree branch and a lack of sleep, I fell back asleep until Rose woke me up around dawn. Everyone was awake now, and we decided to go and hike a little. We decided to go in 2 groups because we planned on spending the night again, and we didn't want anyone messing with our stuff. Even though these woods weren't popular with camping, we didn't want to take the risk, especially after last night. So Margaret, Lynn, Rose and I, we left to go hiking for a couple of hours while the boys opted to stay behind and fish and swim and cook food and stuff. We hiked for, I think it was about 2 hours, and we came back to the boys, not at the campsite. Annoyed, Margaret went down to the lake with Lynn to find them. Rose and I made our way back to the tents, and I'll be honest and say that I screamed and almost wet my pants. The tents, they were completely slashed. I inspected it closer after regaining composure because I was usually the more collected one of the 2 of us. And it seemed to have been made with a knife of some sort, and the cuts were small, so maybe a small knife. Our tents were made of material that was pretty hard to cut into too, and it seemed like the person had some sort of pocket knife, I guessed. The boys, Margaret and Lynn, came running to our screams and were obviously startled. After that, we decided to pack up and head home early, because for one, the tents were ripped too much to use again comfortably, and 2, Rose and Lynn and I were really creeped out at this point. And, even more so, when Todd announced that his tires were slashed. We were all freaking out, obviously, because there was no cell service. Todd's tires were slashed, and there was no way any of us wanted to stay any longer. Luckily, Todd reported that Margaret's tires looked fine, and Margaret stated that she would take Noah and Lynn, drop them off and call 911 and their parents, and come back for us. She drove a car, and there wasn't enough room for more than 3 people as the back was filled up with the camping stuff. Zach, Todd, Rose and I, we were left at the campgrounds, and we decided to begin a hike back towards the main road so Margaret wouldn't have to drive so far. Also, Rose and I refused to stay anywhere near the camping area anymore because we were just too creeped out. So, we began hiking. My phone died, and the last time I looked at it was in the afternoon. Zach and Rose, they both had working phones and constantly updated as to how far we had been walking. As we were walking, though, I began to hear branches snapping from behind us, closer to the trees than we walked, and I got more and more paranoid as time went on. I told Todd too, and he seemed to get more wary of our surroundings, constantly looking over his shoulder. We had been walking for about 30 minutes now, I think. Margaret was probably at Noah's house or almost there by this time when Todd screamed, "Run." Naturally, I looked behind my shoulder before I began running, and 3 hooded figures were running towards us. 2 had knives, and they all looked around 6'3" or taller. Todd was 6'1" and pretty big, but there was just no way that he could defend all of us against 3 guys. Even though it was broad daylight, I couldn't make out any facial features. They all appeared over or around 200 pounds. The shortest one was probably 6'2", but they all wore hoods and had masks on, like ski masks. We began running and dropped some of our stuff, and the 3 guys just gave up after a while or decided that we weren't worth terrorizing because eventually we lost them. Well, we made it to the main road where we waited, walking quickly, constantly looking over our shoulders in fear until Margaret finally arrived. We told the police everything, and they searched the woods nearby, and they just never found any evidence that we had even been there, or the guys were there, or that anything happened besides pictures of the lake around the area and the shredded tents. I don't know what would have happened if they had caught us. I mean, I'm fairly tall, and I was around 5'10" during this time. Only around 125 pounds, though, and Rose was around 5'1" and 100 pounds, and Zach was barely 5'9" at the time. He probably outweighed me, though, by about 10 pounds maximum. Either way, though, I don't think we could have taken those guys on. And so, I'm really thankful that we all got physical activity regularly and were fast enough to just outrun them, and that they eventually just gave up. But I will never go back to that spot again. Back in about the year 2000 or 2001, I was driving by myself from visiting my mum in Colorado back to Arizona. I was in a station wagon and had a desk my mum had given me that was my grandfather's. Now, I've always been scared driving at night that there is someone in my back seat that is going to get me. This might be because of too many scary movies or because my mum's paranoia just rubbed off on me. I was in the army and drove back and forth a lot to visit her, and she would get mad at me for sleeping at rest stops or gas stations and tell me that someone was going to kidnap me and kill me or something. But I just didn't want to be bothered with the hassle and expense of a motel most of the time. Anyway, I digress. So, I'm driving on an empty stretch of highway late at night with no other cars around. This red truck comes up behind me, flashing his lights and honking his horn at me. I was thinking to myself that there was something wrong with my car, or maybe there was something wrong with the desk in the hatchback. Because why else would he be insistent on pulling me over, right? So, I pull over, and I was in my mid-20s and still a bit naive at this point, and I get out of my car. As I'm getting out of my car, he's directly behind me and still flashing his lights and honking his horn. I got to about the middle of the car. I planned on going to the back to see what could have been wrong with my car when it hit me. Why is he still honking at me when I'm out of my car? Well, that's really odd. And then he gets out of his truck. And that's when I saw something that just wasn't right. I jumped back in my car and sped off, and the next exit was 45 miles or so away, and he followed me the entire time. I take the first exit and go to a crowded grocery store with a laundromat next to it. There was an ambulance parked at the laundromat with its lights flashing, and I was next to it. I figured that if there was an ambulance, then eventually a police officer should come. But the man stayed in his truck in the grocery store parking lot, just watching me the entire time. And honestly, I was really terrified. I did not want to get out of my car, and I felt like an idiot if I would have to tell someone what happened. And I waited about an hour, and he finally left. After he left, I waited a little longer before continuing my drive back to Arizona. And I was paranoid and watchful for any red trucks the entire time. So, fast forward about 5 or 6 years, and I'm watching Unsolved Mysteries or some similar type crime show with my hubby at the time. He knew what had happened as we were dating when it happened. And what story pops up? One about a man on that exact stretch of highway with a red truck that used those exact tactics to get a few women to pull over and apparently murdered them. I really am glad that my gut told me that something was wrong, and to just get back in my car and drive.